Do you want to successfully complete the C180 Objective Assessment exam? Then you are in the right place. Our website provides a list of questions and answers for your success in the C180 OA exam for free. We understand that acing your OA exam can be quite challenging. That's why we provide completely free exam guides and practice questions for you. In this video, we will cover questions from brain structure, learning types, memory processes, psychology schools, and professional roles. So, let's get started. 1. When a therapist helps a client overcome social anxiety by gradually exposing them to feared social situations while teaching relaxation techniques, which psychological level of analysis is primarily being addressed through this behavioral intervention approach? A. The brain level. B. The person level. C. The group level. D. The cultural level. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. The person level. Explanation: option B is correct because the person level focuses on mental contents and processes, including thoughts, feelings, and behaviours, which are directly targeted through behavioural interventions like exposure therapy. Option A is incorrect because the brain level specifically examines neural structures, brain activity, and physiological processes rather than therapeutic interventions focused on changing thoughts and behaviours. Option C is incorrect because the group level analyses how collections of people and social dynamics influence behaviour, not individual therapeutic techniques targeting personal mental processes. Option D is incorrect because the cultural level examines broader societal and cultural influences on behaviour, not individual therapeutic interventions focused on personal anxiety management. Let's dive into one of psychology's fundamental frameworks for understanding human behaviour. Psychology analyses behaviour at 3 distinct levels: the brain level, the person level, and the group level. Each level offers a unique lens through which we examine thoughts, feelings, and actions. When a therapist uses behavioural interventions like exposure therapy combined with relaxation techniques to help someone overcome social anxiety, they're primarily working at the person level. This level focuses on mental contents and processes, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviours that can be directly modified through therapeutic techniques. The brain level would involve examining neural structures and brain chemistry, while the group level would analyse social dynamics and cultural influences. By targeting the person level, the therapist helps the client change their mental processes and behavioural responses to feared situations. 2. Which school of psychological thought would most likely examine why humans develop the ability to recognise facial expressions of fear, arguing that this capacity evolved because it helped ancestors survive threats? A. Structuralism. B. Behaviorism. C. Evolutionary psychology. D. Gestalt psychology. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Evolutionary psychology. Explanation: option C is correct because evolutionary psychology examines how natural selection shaped mental strategies and goals, focusing on why certain cognitive abilities like fear recognition evolved to enhance survival and reproduction. Option A is incorrect because structuralism focused on breaking down consciousness into basic elements using introspection rather than examining adaptive functions or evolutionary origins of mental processes. Option B is incorrect because behaviorism concentrated solely on observable stimulus-response relationships and rejected studying internal mental processes or evolutionary origins of behaviour patterns. Option D is incorrect because Gestalt psychology emphasised how people perceive whole patterns rather than examining evolutionary adaptations or why specific mental capabilities developed over time. Here's a fascinating question about how psychology approaches human evolution and adaptation. Different schools of thought in psychology have different ways of explaining why we behave the way we do. Evolutionary psychology takes a unique approach by looking backward into our ancestral past to understand modern behavior. This school asks, why did humans develop certain mental abilities? For example, recognizing facial expressions of fear likely evolved because it helped our ancestors identify and respond to threats quickly, increasing their chances of survival. This is fundamentally different from structuralism, which broke consciousness into elements, or behaviorism, which focused only on observable stimulus-response patterns. Gestalt psychology examined whole patterns of perception. Evolutionary psychology specifically examines how natural selection shapes cognitive strategies and goals over thousands of generations, making it the only approach that explains mental abilities through the lens of survival and reproductive success. 3. A clinical psychologist works with patients experiencing depression and anxiety, providing therapy and administering psychological tests, while a psychiatrist in the same clinic prescribes medications and monitors their effects. What is the primary distinction between these two professionals? A. Education level achieved. B. Types of disorders treated. C. Medical training and prescribing authority. D. Therapeutic techniques used. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. C. Medical training and prescribing authority. Explanation. Option C is correct because psychiatrists are physicians with medical degrees who can prescribe medications, while clinical psychologists have doctoral degrees in psychology but typically cannot prescribe medications in most jurisdictions. Option A is incorrect because both professionals achieve doctoral level education, with clinical psychologists earning PhDs or PsyDs and psychiatrists earning medical degrees, making education levels similar. Option B is incorrect because both clinical psychologists and psychiatrists can treat similar ranges of psychological disorders, with their approaches differing in method rather than disorder type. Option D is incorrect because both professionals may use similar psychotherapy techniques, with the key difference being medical training and medication prescribing authority rather than therapeutic approach. Let's clarify an important distinction between two mental health professionals you might encounter. Both clinical psychologists and psychiatrists work with patients experiencing depression and anxiety, and both provide valuable therapeutic support. However, there's a crucial difference in their training and what they can do for patients. Clinical psychologists earn doctoral degrees in psychology, either a PhD or PsyD, and receive extensive training in psychotherapy, psychological testing, and assessment. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, are medical doctors who attend medical school, complete residency training in psychiatry, and can prescribe medications because of their medical training. This medical training and prescribing authority is the primary distinction. While both professionals may use similar therapy techniques and treat similar disorders, only psychiatrists can write prescriptions and monitor medication effects. Clinical psychologists focus on psychological interventions and testing, making medical training and prescribing authority the key difference. 4. Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory and used introspection to identify the building blocks of consciousness, including sensations and feelings. Which school of thought did his work establish? A. Functionalism. B. Structuralism. C. Behaviorism. D. Psychodynamic theory. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Structuralism. Explanation, option B is correct because Wundt founded structuralism, which sought to analyze consciousness by identifying its smallest components and the rules determining how sensations and feelings combine into mental structures. Option A is incorrect because functionalism, associated with William James, focused on why mental processes occur and how they help adaptation rather than breaking consciousness into elements. Option C is incorrect because behaviorism emerged later with Watson and Skinner, rejecting introspection entirely to focus exclusively on observable behavior rather than internal conscious experiences. Option D is incorrect because psychodynamic theory, developed by Freud, emphasized unconscious mental conflicts and psychosexual development rather than conscious sensations identified through introspection. Now let's travel back to the birth of psychology as a science. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, marking the formal beginning of psychology as an experimental science. Wundt wanted to understand consciousness by breaking it down into its most basic components, much like a chemist might break down a compound into its elements. He used a method called introspection, where trained observers would carefully examine and report their own conscious experiences, sensations, and feelings. This approach of analysing consciousness by identifying its smallest building blocks, sensations from our sense organs and feelings like fear or love, and then discovering the rules for how these elements combine, became known as structuralism. Wundt literally founded this first school of psychological thought. This was different from functionalism, which came later and asked why mental processes occur, different from behaviorism, which rejected studying internal experiences, and different from psychodynamic theory, which focused on unconscious conflicts. 5. When William James studied how paying attention helps individuals survive and adapt to their environment, he was applying Darwin's theory of natural selection to mental characteristics. Which psychological approach best describes this perspective? A. Structuralism, B. Functionalism, C. Gestalt psychology, D. Cognitive psychology. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer B. Functionalism. Explanation: option B is correct because functionalism examined why humans think, feel and behave as they do, focusing on how mental processes help individuals adapt to their environments through natural selection. Option A is incorrect because structuralism focused on identifying the basic elements of consciousness through introspection, rather than examining adaptive functions or evolutionary purposes of mental processes. Option C is incorrect because Gestalt psychology emphasized perceiving whole patterns rather than examining how specific mental abilities like attention contribute to survival and environmental adaptation. Option D is incorrect because cognitive psychology emerged later, focusing on information processing, similar to computers, rather than specifically examining evolutionary, adaptation, and survival functions. Let's explore how psychology connected with Darwin's revolutionary theory of evolution. William James, often called the father of American psychology, took a completely different approach from the structuralists. Instead of asking what consciousness is made of, James asked a more practical question. Why do we have these mental abilities? What purpose do they serve? He was deeply influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, which explains how traits that help organisms survive and reproduce become more common over generations. James applied this evolutionary thinking to psychology. For example, when James studied how paying attention helps us survive and adapt to our environment, he was examining the adaptive function of attention. This focus on the purpose and usefulness of mental processes, on how they help us adapt to our world, defines functionalism. It's not about breaking consciousness into pieces like structuralism, not about perceiving wholes like Gestalt psychology, and not about information processing like cognitive psychology. Functionalism uniquely asks why and how mental processes aid survival and adaptation. 6. A researcher demonstrates that people perceive a triangle even when shown 3 Pac-Man shapes arranged strategically, arguing that perception involves organising sensory information into meaningful patterns. Which approach emphasises that the whole is more than the sum of its parts? A. Behaviorism, B. Structuralism, C. Gestalt psychology, D. Psychodynamic theory. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C, Gestalt psychology. Explanation, option C is correct because Gestalt psychology focused on how people organize and interpret sensory information, emphasizing that perceptual experiences form unified wholes that exceed the sum of individual sensory elements. Option A is incorrect because behaviorism rejected studying internal processes like perception, instead focusing exclusively on observable stimulus-response relationships without examining mental pattern formation. Option B is incorrect because structuralism attempted to reduce consciousness to its smallest elements, taking the opposite approach by analysing parts rather than unified wholes or patterns. Option D is incorrect because psychodynamic theory emphasised unconscious conflicts and psychosexual development rather than perceptual organisation, or how sensory information forms unified conscious experiences. Here's a classic demonstration that reveals something profound about human perception. Imagine you're shown 3 Pac-Man shapes. Those circular shapes with a wedge cut out, like the old video game character. When these 3 shapes are arranged just right, with their open mouths pointing toward the centre, something amazing happens. Your brain doesn't just see 3 separate shapes. Instead, you perceive a complete triangle floating in the middle, even though no triangle is actually drawn. This phenomenon fascinated a group of German psychologists in the early 20th century who founded Gestalt psychology. Their revolutionary insight was that perception isn't just about detecting individual sensory elements. It's about organising those elements into meaningful wholes. The famous phrase, "the whole is more than the sum of its parts," captures this perfectly. This is completely opposite to structuralism, which tried to reduce consciousness to basic elements. It's different from behaviorism, which ignored internal perception entirely, and different from psychodynamic theory, which focused on unconscious conflicts rather than perceptual organisation. 7. John Watson and B.F. Skinner rejected studying internal mental states, arguing that psychology should focus exclusively on observable actions and the environmental factors that control them. Which school of thought did they champion? A. Behaviorism, B. Cognitive psychology, C. Humanistic psychology, D. Structuralism. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, A. Behaviorism. Explanation, option A is correct because Watson and Skinner established behaviorism, which rejected introspection and mental states to focus solely on observable behaviour, stimuli responses, and the consequences of actions. Option B is incorrect because cognitive psychology, emerging later with the computer analogy, explicitly reintroduced the study of internal mental processes like memory and information processing. Option C is incorrect because humanistic psychology emphasised subjective experiences, free will, and positive human potential rather than focusing exclusively on observable behaviour and environmental control. Option D is incorrect because structuralism, founded by Wundt earlier, used introspection to study internal conscious experiences rather than focusing exclusively on observable external behaviour. Let's discuss a radical shift in psychology that happened in the early 20th century. John Watson and B.F. Skinner became frustrated with psychology's focus on internal mental states that couldn't be directly observed or measured objectively. Watson famously declared that psychology should abandon introspection and consciousness entirely. Why? Because these internal experiences couldn't be verified scientifically by outside observers. Instead, Watson and Skinner argued that psychology should focus exclusively on what we can see and measure, actual behaviour. They believed that all behaviour could be understood through observable stimuli in the environment, the responses those stimuli produce, and the consequences that follow behaviours. This approach became known as behaviorism. If you can't observe it, measure it, and verify it, behaviorism says it's not scientific psychology. This was a complete rejection of structuralism's introspection, a stark contrast to cognitive psychology, which later reintroduced studying mental processes, and opposed to humanistic psychology, which emphasized subjective experiences and free will. 8. A therapist believes that a client's depression stems from unconscious conflicts between their desires and societal expectations, rooted in childhood experiences. Which theoretical approach guides this therapist's understanding? A. Behaviorism. B. Cognitive psychology. C. Psychodynamic theory. D. Humanistic psychology. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Psychodynamic theory. Explanation. Option C is correct because psychodynamic theory proposes that unconscious mental conflicts between conscious and unconscious thoughts, feelings, and desires significantly influence moods and behaviors throughout life. Option A is incorrect because behaviorism focuses exclusively on observable stimulus-response relationships and environmental conditioning rather than unconscious conflicts or internal mental states. Option B is incorrect because cognitive psychology examines conscious information processing and how thoughts influence emotions rather than unconscious conflicts rooted in childhood experiences. Option D is incorrect because humanistic psychology emphasizes conscious positive regard, free will, and self-actualization rather than unconscious conflicts between desires and societal expectations. Here's a powerful example of how different psychological theories explain the same problem in completely different ways. Imagine a therapist meeting with a client who is experiencing depression. The therapist believes that the root cause isn't just the current life circumstances or thought patterns, but rather unconscious conflicts buried deep in the client's mind. Perhaps there's a conflict between what the client truly desires and what society expects of them, or unresolved issues from childhood experiences that continue to influence their mood today. This therapeutic approach traces back to Sigmund Freud, who revolutionized psychology by proposing that much of what drives our behavior happens outside of conscious awareness. Freud's psychodynamic theory suggests that our minds are like icebergs. Most of the important psychological action happens beneath the surface, in the unconscious. These hidden conflicts, desires, and memories from childhood constantly push and pull against our conscious thoughts and feelings, creating the symptoms we experience. This is fundamentally different from behaviorism's focus on observable conditioning, cognitive psychology's emphasis on conscious thought patterns, and humanistic psychology's focus on free will and positive potential. 9. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow developed an approach emphasizing that people possess positive values, free will, and deep inner creativity, focusing on strengths rather than problems. Which school of thought did they establish? A. Behaviorism. B. Psychodynamic theory. C. Cognitive psychology. D. Humanistic psychology. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Humanistic psychology. Explanation. Option D is correct because humanistic psychology, developed by Rogers and Maslow, emphasized complete respect for clients, positive regard, free will, and helping people achieve self-actualization by applying strengths. Option A is incorrect because behaviorism focused on environmental conditioning and observable behavior rather than emphasizing positive human values, free will, or inner creativity. Option B is incorrect because psychodynamic theory emphasized unconscious conflicts and defense mechanisms rather than focusing on positive human potential, free will, and innate creativity. Option C is incorrect because cognitive psychology examined information processing and how thoughts influence emotions rather than specifically emphasizing positive values, free will, and self-actualization. Let's explore a refreshingly optimistic approach to psychology that emerged as a reaction against both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. In the mid-20th century, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow felt that psychology had become too negative, focusing too much on mental illness, unconscious conflicts, and mechanical conditioning. They asked, what if we focused on what's right with people instead of what's wrong? What if we emphasized human potential, creativity, and growth? This revolutionary perspective became humanistic psychology. Rogers introduced the concept of unconditional positive regard, accepting clients completely without judgment, and believed people have an innate drive towards self-actualization, becoming the best version of themselves. Maslow studied exceptionally healthy, creative individuals to understand human potential. Humanistic psychology emphasizes that people possess positive values, have free will to make choices, and contain deep inner creativity waiting to be unleashed. Rather than seeing people as products of conditioning or victims of unconscious forces, humanistic psychologists see individuals as active agents in their own growth, capable of choosing their paths and reaching their full potential. 10. When cognitive psychologists Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck argued that negative thoughts cause depression rather than result from it, they revolutionized treatment by developing therapies to modify those thoughts. Which broader movement did this work exemplify? A. The behavioral revolution. B. The cognitive revolution. C. The psychodynamic movement. D. The humanistic movement. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. The cognitive revolution. Explanation? Option B is correct because the cognitive revolution of the late 50s and 60s reintroduced studying mental processes, using computer models of information processing to understand how thoughts influence emotions and behaviors. Option A is incorrect because the behavioral revolution emphasized observable actions and rejected internal mental states, rather than focusing on how cognitive processes like thoughts cause emotional disorders. Option C is incorrect because the psychodynamic movement emphasized unconscious conflicts and childhood experiences rather than examining how conscious negative thoughts directly cause and maintain depressive symptoms. Option D is incorrect because the humanistic movement focused on positive regard, self-actualization, and free will, rather than specifically examining how maladaptive thought patterns cause psychological disorders. Now let's examine how psychology made a dramatic comeback in studying the mind after behaviorism had dominated for decades. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, something revolutionary happened. The computer was invented. This technological breakthrough gave psychologists a powerful new metaphor for understanding the human mind. Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, working independently, challenged the prevailing assumption about depression. Traditional views held that depression caused negative thoughts. You feel sad, so you think sad thoughts. But Ellis and Beck flipped this around, arguing that negative thoughts actually cause depression. This insight wasn't just theoretical. It led to the development of cognitive therapy, which helps people identify and change their negative thought patterns. This reversal in understanding, this focus on how mental processes like thoughts influence emotions and behaviors, exemplified the cognitive revolution. Psychology could now study mental processes scientifically by treating the mind like computer software, information processing systems that receive input, process it, and produce output. This wasn't about conditioning like behaviorism, unconscious conflicts like psychodynamics, or positive regard like humanism. The cognitive revolution brought the mind back into psychology. 11. A neuroscientist uses brain imaging to identify which specific brain regions become active when people tell spontaneous lies versus when they recite memorized false stories. Which field combines psychological theories with brain research? A. Behavioral psychology. B. Cognitive neuroscience. C. Psychodynamic theory. D. Social psychology. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Cognitive neuroscience. Explanation. Option B is correct because cognitive neuroscience seeks to understand the nature, organization, and operation of mental processes by studying brain activity, identifying which brain areas give rise to specific mental events. Option A is incorrect because behavioral psychology focuses on observable actions and environmental conditioning, rather than examining brain structures and neural processes underlying specific mental activities. Option C is incorrect because psychodynamic theory emphasizes unconscious conflicts and defense mechanisms rather than identifying specific brain regions responsible for different types of mental processes. Option D is incorrect because social psychology examines how groups and social situations influence thoughts and behaviors rather than investigating brain structures underlying specific mental processes. Here's where psychology meets neuroscience in an exciting collaboration. Imagine a researcher wants to understand the neural basis of lying, specifically whether different types of lies involve different brain regions. Using brain imaging technology like functional MRI, the researcher asks participants to tell two types of lies. Some participants recite lies they've memorized beforehand, while others must create spontaneous lies on the spot. The brain scans reveal something fascinating. Different brain areas light up depending on the type of lie being told. This research perfectly illustrates cognitive neuroscience, a field that combines cognitive psychology's theories about mental processes with neuroscience's methods for studying the brain. Cognitive neuroscientists want to understand the nature, organization, and operation of mental processes by discovering which brain structures and activities give rise to them. This is different from behavioral psychology, which wouldn't examine brain activity at all. Different from psychodynamic theory, which focuses on unconscious conflicts rather than brain mapping. And different from social psychology, which examines group influences rather than neural mechanisms. 12. A researcher finds that students from collectivist cultures prioritize group harmony and family honor, while students from individualist cultures emphasize personal freedom and individual achievement. Which level of analysis examines these cultural influences? A. The brain level. B. The person level. C. The group level. D. The biological level. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. The group level. Explanation. Option C is correct because the group level of analysis focuses on how collections of people, including cultures and societies, shape individual minds and behaviours through shared values and expectations. Option A is incorrect because the brain level examines neural structures, brain activity, and physiological processes rather than how cultural values and social groups influence thoughts and behaviours. Option B is incorrect because the person level focuses on individual mental contents and processes rather than examining how cultural membership and social groups shape individual thinking patterns. Option D is incorrect because the biological level examines genetic and physiological factors rather than analysing how cultural membership and social environments influence values and behavioural priorities. Let's explore how culture powerfully shapes who we become as individuals. Researchers studying personality across different parts of the world have discovered something remarkable. Students from collectivist cultures, common in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, tend to prioritize group harmony, family honor, and maintaining social order. Meanwhile, students from individualist cultures, like the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, tend to emphasize personal freedom, individual achievement, and personal rights. These aren't just minor differences in opinion, they reflect deeply ingrained personality traits shaped by cultural values. This observation involves the group level of analysis in psychology, while the brain level examines neural structures and chemistry, and the person level focuses on individual thoughts and mental processes. The group level investigates how collections of people, from small groups to entire cultures and societies, shape individual minds and behaviours. Culture acts as a powerful force, socializing children according to its values, influencing which personality traits are developed, encouraged, and rewarded. Understanding cultural influences requires analysing at the group level, not the biological or individual psychological level. 13. Which component of a neuron receives incoming signals from other neurons and plays a crucial role in determining whether the neuron will fire an action potential? A. Axon. B. Dendrites. C. Myelin sheath. D. Terminal buttons. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Dendrites. Explanation: option B is correct because dendrites are branching structures extending from the neuron's cell body that receive incoming signals from other neurons, integrating these inputs to determine if activation occurs. Option A is incorrect because axons transmit outgoing signals away from the cell body to other neurons, rather than receiving incoming signals from neighbouring neurons. Option C is incorrect because myelin sheath provides insulation around axons to speed signal transmission, rather than receiving incoming signals from other neurons. Option D is incorrect because terminal buttons are located at axon endings and release neurotransmitters to send signals to other neurons, rather than receiving incoming information. Now let's zoom in to understand the basic building blocks of neural communication. Neurons, the specialized cells that transmit information throughout your nervous system, have distinct parts that work together like a relay team. At one end, you have dendrites. These are branching structures extending from the cell body that act like antennas, receiving incoming signals from thousands of other neurons. Think of dendrites as the receiver in a communication system. These signals arrive at the dendrites from other neurons, and the dendrites collect all this incoming information. The cell body then integrates all these signals to determine whether the neuron should fire an action potential, essentially whether it should send its own message forward. So dendrites are crucial because they're the input system, gathering all the information that determines whether the neuron will activate. This is completely different from axons, which transmit signals away from the cell, different from myelin sheaths, which insulate axons, and different from terminal buttons, which release neurotransmitters at the end of axons. Dendrites are specifically about receiving incoming signals. 14. A patient with Parkinson's disease experiences tremors and difficulty initiating movement due to the degeneration of neurons that produce a specific neurotransmitter. Which neurotransmitter is primarily affected in this condition? A. Serotonin. B. GABA. C. Dopamine. D. Acetylcholine. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Dopamine. Explanation: option C is correct because dopamine is crucial for coordinating smooth movements and motor control, and its deficiency in Parkinson's disease leads to characteristic tremors and movement difficulties. Option A is incorrect because serotonin primarily regulates mood, sleep, and appetite, rather than coordinating motor movements, and its deficiency is more associated with depression. Option B is incorrect because GABA functions as the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, reducing neural excitation rather than specifically coordinating voluntary motor movements. Option D is incorrect because while acetylcholine is involved in muscle activation, Parkinson's disease specifically results from dopamine deficiency rather than acetylcholine depletion. Let's examine a devastating neurological condition to understand how neurotransmitters work. Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder that affects millions of people worldwide. Patients with Parkinson's experience characteristic symptoms: trembling hands, stiff muscles, and difficulty initiating movements, like their body won't obey their commands to start walking. The cause of these symptoms lies in the death of specific neurons in a brain region called the substantia nigra. These neurons normally produce a crucial neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is essential for coordinating smooth, controlled movements. When dopamine-producing neurons die, dopamine levels plummet, and the brain's movement control system essentially breaks down. Imagine trying to conduct an orchestra, but the musicians can't hear your instructions. That's what happens to movement control without adequate dopamine. This is why Parkinson's specifically involves dopamine, not serotonin, which regulates mood and sleep, not GABA, which inhibits neural activity, and not acetylcholine, which, while involved in muscle activation, isn't the primary neurotransmitter deficient in Parkinson's disease. Dopamine depletion directly causes the movement problems. 15. After a stroke damages his hippocampus, a patient can remember events from his childhood, but struggles to form new long-term memories of daily experiences. Which brain function has been most significantly impaired? A. Converting short-term memories to long-term storage. B. Processing visual information from the eyes. C. Regulating body temperature and blood pressure. D. Coordinating voluntary muscle movements. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, A. Converting short-term memories to long-term storage. Explanation. Option A is correct because the hippocampus plays a critical role in memory consolidation, converting new short-term memories into long-term storage, and damage impairs forming new lasting memories. Option B is incorrect because the occipital lobe processes visual information rather than the hippocampus, which specializes in memory formation and consolidation processes. Option C is incorrect because the hypothalamus regulates body temperature, blood pressure, and other homeostatic functions rather than the hippocampus, which handles memory consolidation. Option D is incorrect because the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements and motor control rather than the hippocampus, which specifically handles memory formation and consolidation. Here's a heartbreaking case that teaches us about a crucial brain structure. Imagine a patient who suffers a stroke that damages their hippocampus. When you visit this patient, something remarkable happens. They can tell you vivid stories about their childhood, describe their wedding day in perfect detail, and recall events from years ago with clarity. But here's the tragedy. They can't remember that you visited them yesterday. Every day you're a stranger to them again. They can't form new lasting memories of daily experiences even though their old memories remain intact. This selective memory problems reveals the hippocampus's specific function. The hippocampus acts like a converter or encoder, taking temporary memories from your experiences and transforming them into permanent long-term storage. It's not processing visual information. That's the occipital lobe's job. It's not regulating body temperature. That's handled by the hypothalamus. And it's not coordinating movements. That's the cerebellum. The hippocampus specifically converts short-term memories into long-term storage, which is why damage prevents new lasting memories while leaving old ones untouched. 16. A person experiences intense fear when encountering a dog because their amygdala becomes highly activated, triggering a strong emotional response even before they consciously process the situation. Which brain structure is primarily responsible for processing strong emotions? A. Cerebellum. B. Thalamus. C. Amygdala. D. Corpus callosum. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Amygdala. Explanation. Option C is correct because the amygdala plays a crucial role in processing and generating strong emotional responses, particularly fear and anger, often activating before conscious awareness occurs. Option A is incorrect because the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements and balance rather than processing emotional responses like fear and anger. Option B is incorrect because the thalamus relays sensory information to appropriate brain regions rather than specifically generating or processing strong emotional responses. Option D is incorrect because the corpus callosum enables communication between brain hemispheres rather than processing emotional responses like fear and anger. Let's explore one of the brain's most primitive and powerful structures. Imagine you're walking in the woods and suddenly see something that looks like a snake on the path. Before you can even consciously think snake, your heart is already racing, your body has jumped backward, and intense fear floods through you. This lightning-fast emotional response happens because of the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep in your brain's temporal lobe. The amygdala is your brain's emotional alarm system, particularly for processing strong emotions like fear and anger. It receives sensory information incredibly quickly, even before that information reaches your conscious awareness, and can trigger immediate emotional and physical responses. This is why you can feel afraid before you consciously realize what scared you. The amygdala's rapid processing kept our ancestors alive by enabling split-second reactions to threats. This function is completely different from the cerebellum, which coordinates voluntary movements and balance, different from the thalamus, which relays sensory information, and different from the corpus callosum, which connects the brain's hemispheres. The amygdala specifically processes and generates strong emotional responses. 17. Which brain lobe would be primarily affected if a patient experiences sudden vision loss following a head injury to the back of their skull? A. Frontal lobe. B. Parietal lobe. C. Temporal lobe. D. Occipital lobe. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Occipital lobe. Explanation: option D is correct because the occipital lobe, located at the back of the brain, is the primary visual processing center, and damage to this region directly impairs vision. Option A is incorrect because the frontal lobe handles executive functions, planning, and motor control rather than visual processing, which occurs in the posterior brain region. Option B is incorrect because the parietal lobe processes sensory information related to touch, spatial awareness, and body position, rather than specifically handling visual information. Option C is incorrect because the temporal lobe processes auditory information and language comprehension rather than visual information, which is handled by the occipital region. Here's a medical emergency that reveals how the brain's geography relates to its functions. Imagine an accident victim arrives at the emergency room with head trauma specifically to the back of their skull. After examination, doctors discover the patient has suddenly lost their vision, even though their eyes are perfectly healthy. The damage isn't in the eyes or the optic nerves, it's in the brain itself. This tells us something crucial about brain organization. Different regions of the brain's cortex specialize in different functions, and physical location matters. The occipital lobe sits at the very back of your brain, at the back of your head, and it's entirely devoted to processing visual information. When light enters your eyes, the electrical signals travel along the optic nerve to the occipital lobe at the back of your brain, where the raw sensory data is transformed into meaningful visual perception. Colors, shapes, movement, everything you see. Damage here causes blindness, despite healthy eyes. This is distinct from the frontal lobe at the front, which handles executive functions and motor control, the parietal lobe on top, which processes touch and spatial information, and the temporal lobe on the sides, which handles hearing and language. 18. A musician suffers damage to their temporal lobe following an accident and subsequently struggles to recognize familiar melodies and understand spoken language. Which primary functions does the temporal lobe control? A. Vision and color perception. B. Motor control and movement. C. Touch and spatial awareness. D. Hearing and language processing. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, D. Hearing and language processing. Explanation: option D is correct because the temporal lobe processes auditory information, including music and speech, and handles language comprehension, making it essential for recognizing sounds and understanding verbal communication. Option A is incorrect because vision and color perception are processed by the occipital lobe at the back of the brain rather than the temporal lobe. Option B is incorrect because motor control and voluntary movements are coordinated by the frontal lobe and cerebellum rather than the temporal lobe. Option C is incorrect because touch sensation and spatial awareness are processed by the parietal lobe rather than the temporal lobe, which specializes in auditory processing. Let's explore another fascinating case that maps brain function to location. A talented musician is involved in an accident that damages their temporal lobe. After recovering physically, the musician faces unexpected challenges. They can no longer recognize familiar melodies that they've heard thousands of times, and they struggle to understand spoken language, even though they can see perfectly and can move normally. This reveals the temporal lobe's specialized functions. The temporal lobes, located on the sides of your brain, roughly around your temples, are your brain's primary auditory processing centers. They receive and interpret all sound information, from the simplest beep to complex symphonies. But they do more than just process sound. They're also crucial for language comprehension, understanding what words mean when you hear them. The name temporal comes from the Latin word for temple, referring to its location. This specialization is completely different from the occipital lobe, which handles vision, the frontal lobe, which controls motor movements and planning, and the parietal lobe, which processes touch and spatial awareness. Temporal lobes specifically handle hearing and language processing. 19. Ivan Pavlov discovered that dogs could learn to salivate to the sound of a tone if the tone was repeatedly paired with food presentation. What is this learning process called? A. Operant conditioning. B. Classical conditioning. C. Observational learning. D. Cognitive learning. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Classical conditioning. Explanation. Option B is correct because classical conditioning creates reflexive behaviors by pairing a previously neutral stimulus, like a tone, with an unconditioned stimulus like food, eventually producing conditioned responses. Option A is incorrect because operant conditioning involves learning through consequences of voluntary behaviors rather than creating reflexive responses through stimulus pairing. Option C is incorrect because observational learning occurs by watching others rather than through direct pairing of stimuli that creates automatic, reflexive responses. Option D is incorrect because cognitive learning emphasizes mental processes and understanding rather than the automatic, reflexive associations formed through repeated stimulus pairing. Now let's journey back to the early 20th century to meet Ivan Pavlov and witness one of psychology's most famous discoveries. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist studying digestion in dogs when he noticed something peculiar. The dogs in his laboratory began salivating not just when they saw or smelled food, but also when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistant who fed them. This observation led to groundbreaking experiments. Pavlov would ring a bell, then immediately present food to the dogs. Food naturally causes salivation. That's an automatic, unlearned reflex. But after repeatedly pairing the bell with food, something remarkable happened. The dogs started salivating just from hearing the bell, even when no food appeared. The bell, previously meaningless to the dogs, had become associated with food through repeated pairing. This process of learning, where a neutral stimulus becomes capable of triggering a reflexive response by being paired with a stimulus that naturally produces that response, is called classical conditioning. It's not about voluntary behavior and consequences like operant conditioning, not about watching others like observational learning, and not about understanding concepts like cognitive learning. Classical conditioning creates automatic reflexive responses through stimulus pairing. 20. A child develops an intense fear of doctors after receiving a painful injection during a medical visit, now crying whenever approaching a medical office. Which conditioning principle best explains this reaction? A. Positive reinforcement. B. Negative reinforcement. C. Conditioned emotional response. D. Operant extinction. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C, conditioned emotional response. Explanation. Option C is correct because conditioned emotional responses are emotionally charged reactions elicited by previously neutral stimuli, formed when neutral stimuli become associated with emotionally significant unconditioned stimuli. Option A is incorrect because positive reinforcement involves adding pleasant consequences to increase behaviours rather than explaining how neutral stimuli acquire emotional significance through pairing. Option B is incorrect because negative reinforcement involves removing unpleasant stimuli to increase behaviours rather than explaining how emotional reactions become associated with previously neutral stimuli. Option D is incorrect because operant extinction involves reducing behaviours by removing reinforcement rather than explaining how neutral stimuli develop emotional associations through classical conditioning. Here's a real-world example of how classical conditioning affects our emotions, often in unfortunate ways. Imagine a young child who visits the doctor for a routine checkup. During the visit, the child receives a painful injection, which naturally causes distress and crying. That's an automatic, unlearned response to pain. Now, before this experience, the doctor's office was just a neutral place, meaning nothing special to the child. But through this experience, the doctor's office became paired with pain. The next time the parent tries to take the child to the doctor, something predictable happens. The child starts crying even before entering the building, even when there's no injection planned. The previously neutral doctor's office has now become a conditioned stimulus that triggers an emotional response, fear and crying. This is a perfect example of a conditioned emotional response, where an emotionally charged reaction becomes associated with a previously neutral stimulus through classical conditioning. This isn't about positive or negative reinforcement changing voluntary behaviours, and it's not about operant extinction of reinforced behaviours. It's about classical conditioning, creating an automatic emotional response to what was once a neutral stimulus. 21. A rat learns to press a lever because pressing the lever delivers food pellets, and the behaviour increases in frequency over time. Which learning principle explains this behavioural change? A. Classical conditioning. B. Habituation. C. Operant conditioning. D. Sensory adaptation. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Operant conditioning. Explanation. Option C is correct because operant conditioning explains how behaviours increase or decrease based on their consequences, with reinforcement like food increasing the likelihood of lever-pressing behaviour. Option A is incorrect because classical conditioning involves pairing stimuli to create reflexive responses rather than explaining how voluntary behaviours increase based on their consequences. Option B is incorrect because habituation involves decreased response to repeated stimuli rather than increased voluntary behaviour resulting from positive consequences. Option D is incorrect because sensory adaptation involves diminished sensitivity to constant stimuli rather than learned changes in voluntary behaviour based on environmental consequences. Let's explore a fundamental principle of learning that explains why training works best in certain ways. Imagine you're training a rat in a laboratory to press a lever. Every time the rat presses the lever, a food pellet drops into the cage. At first, the rat might press the lever accidentally while exploring, but something interesting happens. The behaviour starts occurring more and more frequently. Why? Because pressing the lever produces a consequence that the rat finds rewarding: food. This is the essence of operant conditioning, discovered and extensively studied by B.F. Skinner. Unlike classical conditioning, which creates automatic, reflexive responses through stimulus pairing, operant conditioning shapes voluntary behaviours based on their consequences. When a behaviour is followed by something desirable like food, the behaviour is reinforced and becomes more likely to occur again. This is fundamentally different from classical conditioning, which pairs stimuli to create reflexes, different from habituation, which involves decreased responses to repeated stimuli, and different from sensory adaptation, which is about diminished sensitivity. Operant conditioning specifically explains how consequences control voluntary behaviours. 22. When punishment is applied immediately after an undesired behaviour, the individual quickly learns to avoid that action, whereas delayed punishment proves less effective. What explains this difference in learning effectiveness? A. Timing of consequences affects learning strength. B. Punishment always causes emotional trauma. C. Delayed rewards work better than immediate ones. D. Frequency matters more than timing. Do you know the answer? Correct answer. A. Timing of consequences affects learning strength. Explanation. Option A is correct because immediate consequences create stronger associations between behaviours and their outcomes, making learning more effective, while delayed consequences weaken the connection between action and result. Option B is incorrect because while punishment can cause negative emotions, the question specifically addresses timing effectiveness rather than emotional impacts of punishment. Option C is incorrect because this contradicts learning principles, as immediate consequences generally produce more effective learning than delayed ones for both rewards and punishments. Option D is incorrect because while frequency matters, the question specifically addresses timing differences, and immediate consequences consistently prove more effective than delayed ones. Here's a crucial insight about learning that every parent, teacher, and animal trainer needs to understand. Timing matters tremendously. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, a dog jumps on the furniture and immediately, within 1 second, receives a firm verbal correction. The dog quickly learns not to jump on furniture. In the second scenario, a dog jumps on furniture in the morning, but the owner doesn't notice until evening and scolds the dog hours later. This dog takes much longer to learn, if it learns at all, because the connection between the behaviour and consequence is weak. Why does this happen? The strength of learning depends critically on temporal contiguity, how close in time the consequence follows the behaviour. When consequences are immediate, the brain easily forms a strong association between the action and its outcome. When consequences are delayed, the connection weakens because other behaviours occur in between, making it unclear which behaviour caused the consequence. This timing principle applies to both reinforcement and punishment, making immediate consequences far more effective than delayed ones for shaping behaviour. 23. A parent removes television privileges when their child misbehaves, resulting in decreased misbehaviour over time. What type of consequence is being applied to modify the child's behaviour? A. Positive reinforcement. B. Negative reinforcement. C. Positive punishment. D. Negative punishment. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Negative punishment. Explanation. Option D is correct because negative punishment involves removing pleasant stimuli to decrease undesired behaviours, such as removing television privileges to reduce misbehaviour. Option A is incorrect because positive reinforcement involves adding pleasant consequences to increase desired behaviours rather than removing privileges to decrease undesired actions. Option B is incorrect because negative reinforcement involves removing unpleasant stimuli to increase desired behaviours rather than removing pleasant stimuli to decrease undesired behaviours. Option C is incorrect because positive punishment involves adding unpleasant consequences to decrease behaviours rather than removing pleasant stimuli like television privileges. Let's explore an effective but often misunderstood parenting technique. Imagine a parent whose child has been misbehaving, perhaps talking back disrespectfully or refusing to do homework. Instead of yelling or using physical punishment, the parent calmly states that television privileges are removed for the evening. Over the following days and weeks, the parent notices the misbehaviour decreasing. What learning principle is at work here? This is negative punishment, which despite its name doesn't mean being mean or cruel. In operant conditioning terminology, negative means removing or taking away something, and punishment means any consequence that decreases a behaviour. So negative punishment means removing something pleasant to decrease an undesired behaviour. The parent removed something the child enjoys, television, and as a result the unwanted behaviour decreased. This is completely different from positive reinforcement, which adds something pleasant to increase desired behaviours. Different from negative reinforcement, which removes something unpleasant to increase behaviours. And different from positive punishment, which adds something unpleasant to decrease behaviours. Negative punishment specifically removes pleasant things to reduce unwanted actions. 24. Sensory memory briefly holds incoming information for milliseconds to a few seconds, allowing the brain to decide whether to process it further. What happens to sensory information that is not attended to? A. It moves to long-term memory automatically. B. It decays and is lost quickly. C. It stays in sensory memory permanently. D. It transfers to working memory immediately. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. It decays and is lost quickly. Explanation. Option B is correct because sensory memory holds information very briefly, and unattended sensory information decays rapidly within milliseconds to seconds, disappearing if not selected for further processing. Option A is incorrect because information does not automatically move to long-term memory without attention and processing through short-term or working memory stages. Option C is incorrect because sensory memory is extremely brief by nature, holding information only for milliseconds to seconds rather than storing it permanently. Option D is incorrect because information only transfers to working memory when attention is directed toward it, not automatically for all incoming sensory information. Let's understand the very first stage of memory, which operates so quickly you barely notice it exists. Imagine you're walking down a busy street and hundreds of sensations bombard you every second. Car horns, voices, colours, movements, smells. Your brain can't possibly process all of this information deeply, but it needs to hold on to sensory input just long enough to decide what's important and what to ignore. This is the job of sensory memory, the briefest form of memory storage. Sensory memory holds incoming sensory information for an incredibly short time, literally milliseconds to just a few seconds. It's like a temporary buffer that captures a snapshot of everything you sense. For example, when someone waves their hand quickly in front of your face, you see a motion trail for just a fraction of a second. That's sensory memory in action. Now here's the critical part. If you don't pay attention to the information in sensory memory, it simply decays and vanishes almost instantly. Only information that captures your attention moves forward to short-term memory for further processing. Sensory information doesn't automatically transfer to long-term memory, doesn't stay permanently, and doesn't immediately move to working memory unless attention selects it. 25. A student tries to remember a phone number by repeating it over and over until they can write it down. Which memory process is being used to maintain information in short-term memory? A. Elaborative encoding. B. Chunking. C. Rehearsal. D. Retrieval. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Rehearsal. Explanation. Option C is correct because rehearsal involves repeatedly thinking about information to maintain it in short-term memory, preventing it from decaying before it can be used or encoded into long-term storage. Option A is incorrect because elaborative encoding involves connecting new information to existing knowledge, rather than simply repeating information to maintain it temporarily. Option B is incorrect because chunking involves grouping information into meaningful units, rather than repeatedly practicing information to keep it active in memory. Option D is incorrect because retrieval involves accessing previously stored information from long-term memory rather than maintaining information currently held in short-term memory. Here's a memory strategy we've all used, whether we realised it or not. Imagine someone tells you a phone number, 7815553210. You need to remember it just long enough to write it down or dial it, but you don't have a pen handy. What do? Most people automatically start repeating the number over and over in their mind. 781555, 781555. This simple strategy is called rehearsal, and it's one of the primary ways we maintain information in short-term memory. Short-term memory is very limited. It can only hold about 7 items, and only for about 20 to 30 seconds without active maintenance. Rehearsal works by continuously reactivating the information before it fades away, essentially refreshing the memory trace. This is different from elaborative encoding, which involves connecting new information to existing knowledge to create deeper memories. It's different from chunking, which groups information into meaningful units. And it's different from retrieval, which is about accessing already stored long-term memories. Rehearsal is specifically about maintaining information temporarily through repetition. 26. Which memory phenomenon explains why people often remember vivid details about where they were and what they were doing during significant historical events like major disasters or celebrations? A. Semantic memory. B. Procedural memory. C. Flashbulb memory. D. Implicit memory. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Flashbulb memory. Explanation: option C is correct because flashbulb memories are exceptionally vivid, detailed recollections of significant or emotionally charged events, remembered with great clarity, as if frozen in time like photographs. Option A is incorrect because semantic memory stores general facts and concepts rather than vivid personal recollections of specific emotionally significant events. Option B is incorrect because procedural memory stores skills and how to perform actions rather than detailed recollections of specific emotionally significant life events. Option D is incorrect because implicit memory operates unconsciously without deliberate recall, rather than creating vivid, conscious recollections of emotionally significant personal experiences. Let's explore a fascinating type of memory that demonstrates how emotion affects what we remember. Think back to a major historical event like September 11th, or a personal milestone like your high school graduation. When you recall these events, you probably remember not just what happened, but also vivid details about where you were, who you were with, what you were wearing, even what the weather was like. These memories feel different from ordinary memories. They're incredibly vivid, detailed, and feel almost like photographs frozen in time. Psychologists call these flashbulb memories because it's as if a camera's flashbulb went off in your mind, capturing the entire scene in brilliant detail. What makes flashbulb memories special is the role of emotion. When we experience highly significant or emotionally charged events, our brains release stress hormones and neurotransmitters like noradrenaline that enhance memory consolidation. The amygdala, our emotional processing center, becomes very active and essentially tells the hippocampus, "This is important. Remember everything." This creates exceptionally strong, vivid memories. These aren't semantic memories of general facts, procedural memories of skills, or implicit unconscious memories. Flashbulb memories are explicit, conscious, emotionally charged recollections of specific significant events. 27. A witness testifies confidently about details of a crime they observed, but later evidence reveals their memory was influenced by misleading questions asked during police interviews. What memory phenomenon occurred? A. Encoding specificity. B. False memory. C. State-dependent retrieval. D. Procedural memory. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. False memory. Explanation: option B is correct because false memories are recollections of events or details that never actually occurred, often created through suggestions, misleading information, or distorted reconstruction of past events. Option A is incorrect because encoding specificity refers to how retrieval is enhanced by matching encoding contexts, rather than explaining memory distortions caused by misleading information. Option C is incorrect because state-dependent retrieval involves improved recall when psychological states match rather than explaining how misleading questions create inaccurate memory details. Option D is incorrect because procedural memory involves unconscious skill learning rather than explaining how suggestions can create false recollections of events. Here's a sobering lesson about the unreliability of memory that has serious implications for our legal system. Imagine a witness to a crime who confidently testifies about what they saw. Their memory seems clear and detailed, but during the investigation, police asked leading questions like, "Did you see the broken headlight on the car?" when there actually was no broken headlight. Later, when researchers check the facts, they discover the witness's testimony includes details that never actually happened, details that were suggested by the misleading questions. This phenomenon is called false memory. False memories are recollections of events or details that never actually occurred, but feel completely real to the person remembering them. They can be created through suggestions, misleading information, or even by our brain's natural tendency to fill in gaps in our memories with plausible information. The witness isn't lying. They genuinely believe their false memory is real. This is different from encoding specificity, which is about matching contexts to improve retrieval. Different from state-dependent retrieval, which involves matching psychological states, and different from procedural memory, which stores unconscious skills. False memories are specifically about remembering things that didn't actually happen. 28. After suffering head trauma, a patient cannot remember any events that occurred after the injury, struggling to form new memories despite retaining all memories from before the accident. Which type of amnesia is this? A. Retrograde amnesia. B. Anterograde amnesia. C. Infantile amnesia. D. Semantic amnesia. Do you know the answer? Correct answer: B. Anterograde amnesia. Explanation: option B is correct because anterograde amnesia impairs forming new memories after brain damage while leaving previously formed memories intact, creating massive encoding failure for new information. Option A is incorrect because retrograde amnesia involves loss of memories formed before the injury rather than inability to form new memories after the injury. Option C is incorrect because infantile amnesia refers to inability to recall early childhood experiences rather than post-injury inability to form new memories. Option D is incorrect because semantic amnesia is not a standard classification. Anterograde amnesia specifically describes post-injury inability to form new lasting memories. Now let's examine a tragic type of memory loss that reveals how memory systems work. Imagine a patient who suffers severe head trauma in a car accident. When the patient regains consciousness in the hospital, doctors discover something disturbing. The patient has perfect memory of everything that happened before the accident, their childhood, their wedding, what they did last month. But they cannot remember anything that has happened since the accident. Every morning the medical staff must reintroduce themselves because the patient doesn't remember meeting them the day before. This patient has anterograde amnesia, a condition where new long-term memories cannot be formed after brain damage occurs. The word anterograde means forward in time. The amnesia affects memory moving forward from the injury. What's happening in the brain? The injury, particularly if it damaged the hippocampus, has disrupted the memory consolidation process. Short-term memories are still formed momentarily, but the brain cannot convert them into lasting long-term storage. It's like trying to save a document on a computer with a broken hard drive. You can work on the document temporarily, but it can't be permanently saved. This is completely different from retrograde amnesia, which erases memories formed before the injury, not after. 29. A person studies material while drinking coffee in a noisy cafeteria and later performs best on tests taken in similar cafeteria settings. Which retrieval principle explains this performance pattern? A. Elaborative rehearsal. B. Context-dependent retrieval. C. Procedural memory. D. Semantic processing. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Context-dependent retrieval. Explanation. Option B is correct because context-dependent retrieval explains that memory performance improves when the physical environment during retrieval matches the environment where information was originally learned. Option A is incorrect because elaborative rehearsal involves connecting new information to existing knowledge during encoding rather than explaining environmental influences on retrieval. Option C is incorrect because procedural memory involves unconscious skill learning rather than explaining how matching environmental contexts improves conscious memory recall. Option D is incorrect because semantic processing involves understanding meaning during encoding rather than explaining how environmental context affects retrieval effectiveness. Let's explore a fascinating phenomenon that shows how memory is deeply connected to context. Imagine a student who always studies for exams while sitting in a noisy, bustling coffee shop, drinking coffee, surrounded by the smell of espresso and the sounds of people chatting. When exam day arrives, this student decides to take practice tests in the same coffee shop with the same environmental conditions, same sounds, smells, and setting. Surprisingly, the student performs better on those practice tests than when practicing in a quiet library. Why does this happen? This is context-dependent retrieval, a principle stating that memory performance improves when the physical environment during retrieval matches the environment where information was originally learned. Your brain doesn't just encode the information you're studying, it also encodes the surrounding environmental cues, sights, sounds, smells, and settings. These environmental cues become retrieval cues that help trigger the memories. This isn't about elaborative rehearsal during encoding, isn't about procedural skill memory, and isn't about semantic processing of meaning. Context-dependent retrieval specifically involves how matching physical environments improves memory recall. 30. Learning the names of new campers this summer interferes with remembering the names of last summer's campers, even though those names were well known previously. Which memory interference pattern is occurring? A. Proactive interference. B. Retroactive interference. C. Encoding failure. D. Retrieval suppression. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Retroactive interference. Explanation. Option B is correct because retroactive interference occurs when newly learned information disrupts recall of previously learned information, such as new names interfering with memory of old names. Option A is incorrect because proactive interference occurs when old information disrupts learning new information rather than new information disrupting recall of old information. Option C is incorrect because encoding failure occurs when information is never properly stored rather than when new learning disrupts recall of previously stored information. Option D is incorrect because retrieval suppression involves actively blocking memories rather than automatic interference caused by learning similar new information. Here's a common memory problem that explains why learning similar information can be tricky. Imagine you've been a camp counselor for several summers, and each summer you work with a new group of campers. Last summer you knew all your campers' names perfectly: Sarah, Michael, Jessica, Brandon. But this summer you have a completely new group and you need to learn their names: Sophie, Mason, Jennifer, Brett. Here's the problem. When you try to remember last year's campers' names now, you struggle. Learning this summer's names has interfered with your memory of last summer's names. This is called retroactive interference. Retroactive means acting backward. The new learning reaches back in time and disrupts old memories. The newly learned information interferes with your ability to recall previously learned information, especially when the new and old information are similar. This is the opposite of proactive interference, where old learning disrupts new learning. It's not encoding failure, which is when information never gets stored properly in the first place. And it's not retrieval suppression, which involves actively blocking memories. Retroactive interference specifically occurs when new learning disrupts recall of old information. 31. Sigmund Freud proposed that personality consists of three structures constantly interacting. One seeking immediate gratification, another balancing reality with desires, and a third representing moral conscience. Which structure represents moral conscience and societal rules? A. ID, B. Ego, C. Superego, D. Libido. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Superego. Explanation: option C is correct because the superego represents internalized moral standards, societal rules and parental values, functioning as the conscience that judges whether actions are right or wrong. Option A is incorrect because the ID operates on the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of desires without considering morality or social appropriateness. Option B is incorrect because the ego balances demands between the ID and superego, mediating between desires and reality rather than specifically representing moral conscience. Option D is incorrect because libido represents psychic energy driving behavior rather than the personality structure representing moral conscience and societal expectations. Let's dive into one of psychology's most influential and controversial theories of personality. Sigmund Freud proposed that personality isn't a single unified thing, but rather consists of three separate structures constantly battling for control of your behavior. The first structure, the ID, operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It wants immediate gratification of all desires and needs, like a demanding infant screaming for food. The second structure, the ego, develops as we grow and learn about reality. The ego tries to satisfy the id's desires, but in realistic, socially appropriate ways. It's the mediator, the rational decision maker, but Freud proposed a third structure called the superego, which represents your conscience, your internalized sense of morality and societal rules. The superego is like a strict parent inside your head, constantly judging whether your actions are right or wrong according to moral and social standards. It contains the values and moral principles you absorbed from your parents and culture. When you feel guilty for doing something wrong, that's your superego at work. The ID seeks pleasure. The ego manages reality. But the superego specifically represents moral conscience and societal rules. 32. Carl Rogers believed that therapists should provide complete acceptance and support regardless of what clients say or do, creating conditions for personal growth. What did Rogers call this therapeutic stance? A. Systematic desensitization. B. Free association. C. Unconditional positive regard. D. Cognitive restructuring. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Unconditional positive regard. Explanation. Option C is correct because unconditional positive regard involves accepting and supporting clients completely, without judgment or conditions, helping them feel valued regardless of their thoughts or behaviours. Option A is incorrect because systematic desensitization is a behavioural technique for treating phobias through gradual exposure, rather than a therapeutic stance of complete acceptance. Option B is incorrect because free association is a psychoanalytic technique where clients speak freely without censorship, rather than a therapeutic attitude of unconditional acceptance. Option D is incorrect because cognitive restructuring involves changing maladaptive thought patterns rather than providing unconditional acceptance and support to clients. Let's explore a revolutionary therapeutic approach that changed how psychologists help people. Carl Rogers, a founder of humanistic psychology, believed that people have an innate drive toward growth and self-actualization. But psychological problems arise when people feel judged and conditionally valued by others. Rogers proposed that therapy should create a special environment where clients feel completely safe to explore their thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. He called this approach unconditional positive regard. Unconditional means without conditions, no strings attached. Positive regard means acceptance and support. So unconditional positive regard means accepting and supporting clients completely, regardless of what they say or do, without judging them. Rogers believed that when clients experience this complete acceptance, they feel free to explore their true selves, confront difficult emotions, and move toward personal growth. This therapeutic stance isn't a technique like systematic desensitization for treating phobias, isn't a psychoanalytic method like free association for revealing unconscious content, and isn't cognitive restructuring for changing thought patterns. Unconditional positive regard is specifically a therapeutic attitude of complete acceptance without conditions. 33. Albert Bandura demonstrated that children could learn aggressive behaviors simply by watching adults behave aggressively without receiving any direct reinforcement themselves. Which learning process did this research identify? A. Classical conditioning. B. Operant conditioning. C. Observational learning. D. Habituation. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. C. Observational learning. Explanation: option C is correct because observational learning occurs when individuals acquire new behaviours by watching others without needing direct reinforcement or punishment to learn the behaviour themselves. Option A is incorrect because classical conditioning involves pairing stimuli to create reflexive responses rather than learning behaviours through watching others without direct experience. Option B is incorrect because operant conditioning requires direct consequences for one's own behaviour, rather than learning simply by observing others' actions and their outcomes. Option D is incorrect because habituation involves decreased response to repeated stimuli, rather than acquiring new behaviours through watching and imitating others' actions. Here's a landmark study that changed how we think about learning. In the early 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted his famous Bobo doll experiments. Children watched an adult interact with an inflatable clown doll called Bobo. Some children saw the adult behave aggressively, hitting, kicking, and punching the doll while shouting aggressive words. Other children saw the adult playing quietly with other toys, ignoring the Bobo doll. The key part: the children themselves never received any reinforcement or punishment. They just watched. Later, when given a chance to play with the Bobo doll themselves, the children who had observed the aggressive model displayed significantly more aggressive behaviours toward the doll, imitating the specific actions they'd seen. This demonstrated a type of learning that behaviourists like Skinner said was impossible: learning without direct reinforcement. Bandura called it observational learning or modelling, acquiring new behaviours simply by watching others without needing personal experience of consequences. This isn't classical conditioning with paired stimuli, isn't operant conditioning requiring direct consequences, and isn't habituation involving decreased responses. Observational learning is specifically learning by watching others. 34. People from cultures emphasizing group harmony, family honor, and social order tend to develop personalities valuing humility and caring for others. What type of cultural orientation produces these personality characteristics? A. Individualist. B. Collectivist. C. Egocentric. D. Autonomous. Do you know the answer? Correct answer: B. Collectivist. Explanation: Option B is correct because collectivist cultures prioritize group needs over individual needs, emphasizing family honor, social harmony, and responsibility to others, which shapes personality development accordingly. Option A is incorrect because individualist cultures emphasize personal freedom, individual achievement, and equality rather than prioritizing group harmony and family honor. Option C is incorrect because egocentric describes self-focused thinking rather than a cultural orientation that emphasizes group needs and family responsibilities. Option D is incorrect because autonomous describes independence and self-governance rather than cultural values emphasizing group harmony, family obligations, and social interdependence. Let's examine how culture profoundly shapes personality development across the globe. Cross-cultural psychologists have discovered that personality traits vary systematically between different types of cultures. In collectivist cultures, common in Asian countries like Japan and China, African nations, and Latin American societies, children grow up learning that the group's needs take priority over individual desires. These cultures emphasize group harmony, honoring family and ancestors, maintaining social order, and taking care of others, even strangers. Children in collectivist cultures develop personality traits that reflect these values. They tend to be more humble, more focused on relationships and social connections, and more concerned with not disrupting group harmony. This cultural orientation values interdependence, seeing yourself as part of a larger social network where everyone depends on each other. In contrast, individualist cultures like the United States emphasize personal freedom, individual rights, and self-expression. Collectivist cultures specifically produce personalities that prioritize group needs, family honor, and social harmony. This isn't about individualist values of personal freedom, egocentric self-focused thinking, or autonomous independence. Collectivist cultures specifically emphasize group needs over individual needs. 35. A student believes they control their own destiny through hard work and personal decisions, taking responsibility when things go wrong. Which personality characteristic is being demonstrated? A. External locus of control. B. Low self-efficacy. C. Internal locus of control. D. High neuroticism. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. C. Internal locus of control. Explanation. Option C is correct because internal locus of control describes believing that personal actions and decisions control life outcomes, leading individuals to feel responsible for both successes and failures. Option A is incorrect because external locus of control involves attributing outcomes to outside forces like luck or other people rather than personal control. Option B is incorrect because self-efficacy refers to believing in one's ability to perform specific behaviours rather than general beliefs about control over life outcomes. Option D is incorrect because neuroticism refers to emotional instability and negative emotions rather than beliefs about personal control over life events. Here's a personality characteristic that predicts how people interpret both successes and failures in their lives. Imagine two students both receive a low grade on an exam. The first student thinks I should have studied harder, I need to manage my time better, I can improve this. This student takes personal responsibility for the outcome. The second student thinks the test was unfair, the professor doesn't like me, I had bad luck. This student attributes the outcome to external factors beyond their control. These students differ in their locus of control. Locus means location or place. Locus of control refers to where you believe control over your life outcomes resides. The first student demonstrates internal locus of control, believing that personal actions, decisions, and efforts control life outcomes. People with internal locus of control take responsibility for both successes and failures, believing they have the power to influence results through their choices and behaviours. This is different from external locus of control, where people attribute outcomes to luck or outside forces, different from low self-efficacy, which is about confidence in specific abilities, and different from high neuroticism, which involves emotional instability. Internal locus of control specifically means believing you control your own destiny. 36. When asked to describe someone's personality, people often use trait labels like nervous or friendly, yet research shows behaviour varies significantly across situations. What did Mischel propose instead of broad traits? A. Defence mechanisms. B. Personality signatures. C. Unconditional regard. D. Observational patterns. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Personality signatures. Explanation. Option B is correct because Mischel proposed personality signatures, describing consistent if-then patterns, such as being nervous specifically when meeting new people, rather than nervous in all situations. Option A is incorrect because defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies for managing anxiety in psychodynamic theory rather than situation-specific behavioral patterns. Option C is incorrect because unconditional regard describes therapeutic acceptance in humanistic psychology rather than situation-specific consistency in behavior patterns. Option D is incorrect because observational patterns is not Mischel's specific terminology for describing situation-specific behavioral consistencies rather than broad trait labels. Let's explore how modern psychology moved beyond simple trait labels to understand personality more precisely. Traditional trait psychology might describe someone as consistently nervous across all situations, but psychologist Walter Mischel noticed something important. People's behaviour actually varies quite a bit, depending on the situation. The same person might be relaxed with close friends, but nervous when meeting strangers, calm when playing sports, but anxious when taking tests. Mischel argued that consistency isn't found in broad traits, but in situation-specific patterns. He proposed the concept of personality signatures, consistent if-then patterns that describe how people reliably respond to specific situations. For example, instead of saying someone is nervous as a trait, it's more accurate to say this person becomes nervous when meeting new people but feels confident in familiar settings. The personality signature captures the consistent pattern. If this situation, then this response. This concept isn't about defense mechanisms, which are unconscious coping strategies, isn't about unconditional regard, which is therapeutic acceptance, and isn't just observational patterns as a vague term. Personality signatures specifically describe consistent, situation-specific behavioral patterns using if-then relationships. 37. The fundamental attribution error occurs when people judge others' behaviours. Which tendency characterises this common cognitive bias in social perception? A. Attributing own failures to external circumstances. B. Overestimating personality factors in others' behaviour. C. Underestimating situational influences on own behaviour. D. Accurately judging both personal and situational factors. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Overestimating personality factors in others' behaviour. Explanation. Option B is correct because fundamental attribution. Error involves over-attributing others' behaviours to personality traits while underestimating situational factors, assuming behaviour reflects stable personal characteristics rather than circumstances. Option A is incorrect because this describes self-serving bias rather than the fundamental attribution error, which specifically involves judging others rather than oneself. Option C is incorrect because fundamental attribution error involves judging others rather than underestimating situational influences on one's own behaviour. Option D is incorrect because fundamental attribution error represents biased judgment rather than accurate assessment of both personal and situational influences on behaviour. Here's a cognitive bias that affects how we judge other people every single day. Imagine you see a co-worker arrive late to an important meeting. What do you think? Most people immediately assume the person is irresponsible, lazy, or doesn't care about their job, attributing their behaviour to personality traits. But what if you arrive late to a meeting? Then you think about the terrible traffic, the unexpected phone call, the broken alarm clock, attributing your behaviour to situational factors beyond your control. This double standard is called the fundamental attribution error, one of the most robust findings in social psychology. When explaining others' behaviours, we tend to overestimate the influence of personality traits and underestimate the power of situations. We see someone trip and think they're clumsy when actually the floor was slippery. We see someone perform poorly and think they're incompetent when actually they were sick. This bias doesn't describe self-serving bias, which is about explaining our own failures, doesn't describe underestimating situations for ourselves, and doesn't describe accurate judgment. The fundamental attribution error specifically involves overestimating personality factors when judging others' behaviour. 38. According to the diathesis stress model, psychological disorders develop through the interaction of two key factors. Which combination must occur for a disorder to emerge? A. Genetic mutations and environmental toxins. B. Predisposition and triggering stressors. C. Childhood trauma and adult relationships. D. Neurotransmitter imbalances and poor diet. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Predisposition and triggering stressors. Explanation. Option B is correct because the diathesis stress model proposes that psychological disorders emerge when an individual's predisposition or vulnerability combines with specific environmental stressors that trigger disorder onset. Option A is incorrect because the model emphasizes general predisposition and stress rather than specifically requiring genetic mutations and environmental toxins as necessary factors. Option C is incorrect because while these may contribute, the model broadly encompasses any predisposition and stressors rather than specifically requiring childhood trauma and relationship issues. Option D is incorrect because the model includes various predispositions and stressors beyond just neurotransmitter imbalances and dietary factors as necessary components. Let's explore a comprehensive model for understanding why psychological disorders develop. For decades, psychologists debated whether mental illness was primarily biological, psychological, or social in origin. The answer turns out to be, it's complicated. The diathesis stress model proposes that psychological disorders emerge when two key factors combine. First, there must be a diathesis, a predisposition or vulnerability to developing a disorder. This could be genetic, such as inheriting genes that increase risk for depression, or it could be acquired through early experiences like childhood trauma creating vulnerability to anxiety. But here's the crucial insight. Having a predisposition alone doesn't cause the disorder. The second factor must also be present: stressors, specific environmental triggers, or life challenges that activate the vulnerability. For example, someone might carry genetic risk for depression, but remain healthy until experiencing a major life stressor, like losing a job or ending a relationship. The disorder emerges from the interaction between the predisposition and the stressors. This model requires both factors, not just genetic mutations and toxins, not just childhood trauma and relationships, and not just neurotransmitter imbalances and diet. The diathesis stress model specifically requires predisposition plus triggering stressors. 39. A person experiences persistent sadness lasting months, loses interest in previously enjoyed activities, struggles with concentration, and has thoughts of death. Which psychological disorder category includes these symptoms? A. Anxiety disorders. B. Personality disorders. C. Mood disorders. D. Psychotic disorders. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Mood disorders. Explanation. Option C is correct because mood disorders involve disturbances in emotional state, including depressive disorders characterized by persistent sadness, loss of interest, concentration difficulties, and thoughts of death. Option A is incorrect because anxiety disorders involve excessive fear and worry, rather than primarily featuring persistent sadness, loss of interest, and thoughts of death. Option B is incorrect because personality disorders involve enduring maladaptive patterns of behavior and cognition rather than mood disturbances like persistent sadness. Option D is incorrect because psychotic disorders involve distortions in reality perception, like hallucinations rather than primarily mood symptoms like persistent sadness. Let's examine the symptoms that characterize one of the most common categories of mental health disorders. Imagine someone who experiences persistent sadness that lasts for months, not just days. They've lost interest in activities they once enjoyed. Hobbies feel meaningless, spending time with friends brings no pleasure. They struggle to concentrate on simple tasks, have difficulty making decisions, and their sleep and appetite have changed dramatically. Perhaps most concerning, they have recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. These symptoms together point to mood disorders, specifically depressive disorders. Mood disorders involve disturbances in a person's emotional state, prolonged periods of extreme sadness in depression, or alternating between depression and elevated mood in bipolar disorder. The key feature is that mood itself, the emotional state, is the primary problem. These symptoms don't primarily indicate anxiety disorders, which center on excessive fear and worry, don't indicate personality disorders, which involve enduring maladaptive behavior patterns, and don't indicate psychotic disorders, which involve reality distortion like hallucinations. When persistent sadness, loss of interest, concentration difficulties, and thoughts of death are present, mood disorders are indicated. 40. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps clients identify and change maladaptive thought patterns that contribute to emotional distress. Which therapeutic approach does this represent? A. Psychodynamic therapy. B. Humanistic therapy. C. Behavioral therapy. D. Cognitive therapy. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, D. Cognitive therapy. Explanation: option D is correct because cognitive therapy focuses on identifying and modifying dysfunctional thought patterns that cause emotional distress, emphasizing the role of cognition in psychological problems. Option A is incorrect because psychodynamic therapy focuses on unconscious conflicts and childhood experiences rather than systematically identifying and changing current thought patterns. Option B is incorrect because humanistic therapy emphasizes self-actualization and unconditional positive regard rather than specifically targeting and restructuring maladaptive thought patterns. Option C is incorrect because behavioral therapy focuses on changing observable behaviors through conditioning rather than specifically targeting and modifying cognitive patterns and beliefs. Now let's explore a therapeutic approach that revolutionized how psychologists treat emotional problems. In the mid-20th century, psychologists Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck independently developed therapies based on a radical idea: our thoughts create our emotions, not the other way around. If you think I'm a failure, you'll feel depressed. If you think everyone is judging me, you'll feel anxious. These therapists realized that many psychological problems stem from maladaptive thought patterns, systematic errors in thinking that distort reality and cause emotional distress. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, helps clients identify these problematic thoughts and then systematically challenge and change them. For example, a depressed client might think, I always fail at everything. The therapist would help them examine evidence for and against this belief, recognize it as an overgeneralization, and develop a more balanced thought, like I succeed at some things and struggle with others, like everyone. By changing the maladaptive thoughts, the therapy changes the emotions and behaviors that flow from those thoughts. This is fundamentally different from psychodynamic therapy, which explores unconscious conflicts, humanistic therapy, which provides unconditional acceptance, and behavioral therapy, which focuses on changing actions through conditioning rather than targeting thoughts. 41. A therapist gradually exposes a patient with spider phobia to increasingly anxiety-provoking spider-related stimuli while teaching relaxation techniques, helping them overcome their fear through repeated safe exposures. Which therapeutic technique is being used? A. Free association. B. Systematic desensitization. C. Unconditional positive regard. D. Dream analysis. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Systematic desensitization. Explanation. Option B is correct because systematic desensitization treats phobias by gradually exposing clients to feared stimuli in a hierarchy while maintaining relaxation, reducing anxiety through repeated safe exposures. Option A is incorrect because free association involves speaking without censorship to reveal unconscious content, not gradual exposure to feared stimuli with relaxation techniques. Option C is incorrect because unconditional positive regard involves accepting clients without judgment, which doesn't directly address phobias through gradual exposure. Option D is incorrect because dream analysis interprets unconscious symbolism in dreams, and it's not used for systematically exposing clients to feared stimuli to reduce anxiety responses. Let's explore a powerful behavioral technique that helps people overcome one of the most debilitating types of psychological problems: phobias. Imagine a patient with an intense, irrational fear of spiders, so severe that even seeing a picture of a spider triggers panic attacks. Traditional talk therapy might not be enough. Instead, a therapist uses a technique called systematic desensitization. The process works in carefully planned stages. First, the therapist teaches the patient deep relaxation techniques, controlled breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visualization of peaceful scenes. Once the patient can reliably achieve a relaxed state, the therapist introduces a hierarchy of anxiety-provoking spider-related stimuli, starting with the least frightening and gradually progressing to more intense exposures, perhaps starting with just the word spider, then a cartoon drawing, then a realistic photograph, then a video, and eventually a real spider at a distance. At each step, the patient practices maintaining their relaxed state while exposed to the stimulus. Through repeated safe exposures paired with relaxation, the fear response gradually diminishes. This systematic desensitization isn't free association, which reveals unconscious content, isn't unconditional positive regard, which provides acceptance, and isn't dream analysis, which interprets symbolism. Systematic desensitization specifically treats phobias through gradual exposure with relaxation. 42. 3 conditions must be present to diagnose PTSD according to clinical criteria. Which condition involves experiencing recurrent involuntary memories, nightmares or flashbacks, making someone feel like they are reliving the traumatic event? A. Exposure to traumatic event. B. Intrusive symptoms. C. Avoidance behaviors. D. Negative mood changes. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Intrusive symptoms. Explanation. Option B is correct because intrusive symptoms in PTSD include recurrent involuntary memories, nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional distress when reminded of trauma, causing individuals to relive traumatic experiences. Option A is incorrect because exposure to trauma is the precipitating condition rather than the symptom pattern involving recurrent memories, nightmares, and flashbacks. Option C is incorrect because avoidance behaviors involve deliberately staying away from trauma reminders rather than experiencing involuntary, intrusive recollections of the traumatic event. Option D is incorrect because negative mood changes involve persistent fear, guilt, shame, or detachment, rather than specifically describing recurrent memories and flashbacks. Here's a critical clinical diagnosis that requires understanding 3 specific conditions working together. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, develops after someone experiences overwhelming trauma. But not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. Diagnosis requires 3 specific symptom clusters. The first condition is obvious. There must be exposure to a traumatic event involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. But exposure alone isn't enough for diagnosis. The second required condition involves intrusive symptoms. The trauma keeps forcing its way back into consciousness. These are the hallmark symptoms of PTSD: recurrent, involuntary memories that pop up unexpectedly, terrifying nightmares that replay the trauma, flashbacks where the person feels like they're reliving the event as if it's happening right now, and intense emotional distress when reminded of the trauma by sights, sounds, or smells. Or, these intrusive symptoms represent the mind's inability to properly process and file away the traumatic memory. This cluster of intrusive symptoms is one of the 3 essential diagnostic criteria. This isn't about avoidance behaviours alone, isn't just negative mood changes alone, and isn't about exposure alone. Intrusive symptoms specifically involve unwanted, recurring re-experiencing of the traumatic event through memories, nightmares, and flashbacks. 43. Personality disorders are categorized into 3 clusters with distinct characteristics. Which cluster includes personality disorders characterized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior patterns? A, Cluster A, B, Cluster B, C, Cluster C, D, Cluster D. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B, Cluster B. Explanation: option B is correct because Cluster B personality disorders feature dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviours and include antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. Option A is incorrect because Cluster A includes personality disorders characterized by odd or eccentric behaviours rather than dramatic, emotional, or erratic patterns. Option C is incorrect because Cluster C includes personality disorders characterized by anxious or fearful behaviours rather than dramatic, emotional, or erratic patterns. Option D is incorrect because there is no Cluster D in the personality disorder classification system, which only includes clusters A, B, and C. Let's understand how psychologists organize personality disorders into meaningful categories. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual groups personality disorders into 3 clusters based on similar characteristics. Cluster A includes odd and eccentric disorders. Cluster C includes anxious and fearful disorders, but we're focusing on Cluster B, which groups together personality disorders that share a common theme: dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviour patterns. Cluster B is sometimes called the dramatic cluster, because people with these disorders tend to have intense, unstable emotions and dramatic interpersonal relationships. This cluster includes 4 specific disorders. Antisocial personality disorder involves violating others' rights without remorse. Borderline personality disorder features unstable relationships, self-image, and emotions with fear of abandonment. Histrionic personality disorder involves excessive emotionality and attention-seeking behaviours. And narcissistic personality disorder involves grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. What unites these 4 disorders is their shared pattern of dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviours. This isn't Cluster A, which involves odd or eccentric patterns, isn't Cluster C, which involves anxious or fearful patterns, and there is no Cluster D. Cluster B specifically groups dramatic, emotional, and erratic personality disorders. 44. A person experiences extreme mood swings, alternating between periods of deep depression and periods of elevated mood with excessive energy, rapid thoughts, risky behaviour, and decreased need for sleep. Which mood disorder includes these symptoms? A. Major depressive disorder. B. Bipolar disorder. C. Persistent depressive disorder. D. Seasonal affective disorder. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Bipolar disorder. Explanation. Option B is correct because bipolar disorders involve extreme mood swings between depressive episodes and manic episodes characterized by elevated mood, excessive energy, rapid thoughts, and risky behaviors. Option A is incorrect because major depressive disorder involves persistent sadness without the manic episodes featuring elevated mood, excessive energy, and risky behavior. Option C is incorrect because persistent depressive disorder involves chronic low-grade depression without the dramatic mood swings between depression and mania. Option D is incorrect because seasonal affective disorder involves depression related to seasonal changes without the manic episodes featuring elevated mood and excessive energy. Now let's examine a mood disorder characterized by extreme ups and downs that go far beyond normal mood variations. Imagine someone who experiences distinct episodes of drastically different mood states. During some periods lasting days or weeks, they feel profoundly depressed, experiencing persistent sadness, loss of interest in activities, changes in sleep and appetite, difficulty concentrating, and thoughts of death. But then the mood shifts dramatically to the opposite extreme. During manic episodes, this person experiences elevated or irritable mood, excessive energy that makes sleep seem unnecessary, racing thoughts that jump rapidly from topic to topic, inflated self-esteem leading to grandiose beliefs, and engagement in risky behaviours like spending sprees, reckless driving, or inappropriate sexual behaviour. These aren't just good days and bad days, these are extreme mood swings between clinical depression and mania. This pattern defines bipolar disorder. The term bipolar literally means two poles, referring to the two extreme mood states, the depressed pole and the manic pole. This differs from major depressive disorder, which involves only depression without manic episodes, differs from persistent depressive disorder, which involves chronic low-grade depression, and differs from seasonal affective disorder, which involves seasonal patterns. Bipolar disorder specifically involves extreme mood swings alternating between depression and mania. 45. When a patient exhibits pervasive distrust of others, believing without evidence that colleagues are plotting against them, which cluster A personality disorder might be indicated? A. Schizoid personality disorder. B. Schizotypal personality disorder. C. Paranoid personality disorder. D. Avoidant personality disorder. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Paranoid personality disorder. Explanation. Option C is correct because paranoid personality disorder features pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others' motives, believing without evidence that others intend harm or deception. Option A is incorrect because schizoid personality disorder involves lack of interest in relationships and limited emotional expression rather than distrust and suspiciousness. Option B is incorrect because schizotypal personality disorder involves eccentric thoughts and magical thinking, rather than primarily featuring pervasive distrust and suspiciousness. Option D is incorrect because avoidant personality disorder involves fear of criticism and social avoidance rather than pervasive distrust and belief in others' malicious intent. Let's examine a specific cluster A personality disorder that profoundly affects how someone perceives and relates to others. Imagine someone who constantly believes that co-workers are plotting against them, that friends are secretly mocking them, that a spouse is being unfaithful, all without any real evidence to support these beliefs. When others try to reassure them, they interpret the reassurance itself as further proof of deception. This pervasive pattern of distrust and suspiciousness characterizes paranoid personality disorder. The word paranoid comes from Greek roots meaning beyond mind, being beyond rational thinking about others' motives. People with paranoid personality disorder see threat and malicious intent everywhere, even in neutral or benign situations. Someone compliments their work, and they think that's sarcasm meant to humiliate me. A colleague whispers to another, and they think they're definitely talking about me, planning something. This pervasive distrust occurs without evidence and persists despite contrary evidence. This is different from schizoid personality disorder, which involves lack of interest in relationships, different from schizotypal disorder, which involves eccentric beliefs and magical thinking, and different from avoidant personality disorder, which involves fear of rejection rather than pervasive distrust. Paranoid personality disorder specifically features pervasive distrust and suspiciousness, believing others intend harm without evidence. 46. A person experiences intense fear of criticism and rejection, leading them to avoid social interactions and new relationships despite desiring connection. Which cluster C personality disorder exhibits these characteristics? A. Dependent personality disorder. B. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. C. Avoidant personality disorder. D. Borderline personality disorder. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Avoidant personality disorder. Explanation? Option C is correct because avoidant personality disorder involves pervasive fear of criticism, rejection, or disapproval leading to social avoidance and feelings of inferiority despite desiring relationships. Option A is incorrect because dependent personality disorder involves excessive need for care and support rather than primarily avoiding relationships due to fear of rejection. Option B is incorrect because obsessive-compulsive personality disorder involves preoccupation with orderliness and control rather than fear of criticism, leading to relationship avoidance. Option D is incorrect because borderline personality disorder is classified in Cluster B and involves unstable relationships rather than consistent avoidance due to fear. Here's a Cluster C personality disorder that causes significant distress and social isolation. Imagine someone who desperately wants friendships and romantic relationships but avoids social situations because they're terrified of being criticized, rejected, or disapproved of by others. They might decline a party invitation, not because they're antisocial or uninterested, but because they fear people will judge them negatively. At work, they avoid speaking up in meetings despite having good ideas because they worry others will think their contributions are stupid. They might turn down a promotion that involves public presentations because the thought of potential criticism is unbearable. This is avoidant personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. These individuals want connection. That's what distinguishes them from schizoid personality disorder, where people lack interest in relationships. Avoidant individuals crave relationships, but their overwhelming fear of criticism and rejection leads them to avoid the very social interactions they desire. This differs from dependent personality disorder, which involves excessive need for care rather than fear-driven avoidance, differs from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which involves preoccupation with control and perfectionism, and differs from borderline, which is Cluster B, featuring unstable relationships rather than consistent avoidance. 47. Classical conditioning can create powerful learned associations between neutral stimuli and emotional responses. When a previously neutral stimulus becomes associated with an unpleasant experience, leading the person to avoid that stimulus, what has occurred? A. Positive reinforcement. B. Avoidance learning. C. Observational learning. D. Operant extinction. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Avoidance learning. Explanation: option B is correct because avoidance learning in classical conditioning occurs when a conditioned stimulus becomes paired with an unpleasant unconditioned stimulus, leading the individual to avoid the conditioned stimulus. Option A is incorrect because positive reinforcement involves adding pleasant consequences to increase behaviours rather than learning to avoid stimuli through unpleasant associations. Option C is incorrect because observational learning involves acquiring behaviours by watching others rather than developing avoidance through direct unpleasant stimulus associations. Option D is incorrect because operant extinction involves reducing behaviours by removing reinforcement rather than learning to avoid stimuli through classical conditioning associations. Let's revisit classical conditioning to understand a particularly important type of learned behaviour. Remember Pavlov's dogs learning to salivate to a bell? Classical conditioning can create more than just salivation. It can also create learned fear and avoidance behaviours. Imagine a laboratory rat that hears a tone and immediately after the tone receives a mild electric shock to its feet. Naturally, the shock causes the rat to jump and try to escape. That's an unconditioned automatic response to pain. But here's what happens through repeated pairings. The tone, which initially meant nothing to the rat, becomes associated with the painful shock. After several pairings, something interesting occurs. When the rat hears the tone alone, even without any shock following, the rat displays fear responses and tries to avoid or escape the area where the tone occurs. The rat has learned to avoid the conditioned stimulus, the tone, because it predicts something unpleasant. This is called avoidance learning in classical conditioning. The previously neutral stimulus becomes paired with an unpleasant, unconditioned stimulus, and the organism learns to avoid the conditioned stimulus to prevent the unpleasant experience. This isn't positive reinforcement, which adds pleasant consequences, isn't negative reinforcement, which removes unpleasant stimuli to increase behaviour, and isn't operant extinction. Avoidance learning specifically involves classical conditioning, where a conditioned stimulus becomes associated with unpleasant experiences, leading to avoidance. 48. According to the biopsychosocial approach, understanding psychological disorders requires analysing multiple factors. Which factor examines how family dynamics, relationships, and socioeconomic status influence mental health? A. Biological factors. B. Psychological factors. C. Social factors. D. Genetic factors. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Social factors. Explanation: option C is correct because social factors in the biopsychosocial model examine how family dynamics, relationships, social support, life events, and socioeconomic status impact mental health development. Option A is incorrect because biological factors examine genetic predispositions, brain chemistry, and physiological conditions rather than interpersonal relationships and socioeconomic influences. Option B is incorrect because psychological factors examine thought patterns, emotional responses, and coping mechanisms rather than external social relationships and socioeconomic conditions. Option D is incorrect because genetic factors are a subset of biological factors rather than the social component examining family dynamics and socioeconomic influences. Now let's explore the biopsychosocial approach, a comprehensive framework for understanding psychological disorders. For much of psychology's history, mental health professionals debated whether disorders were primarily biological diseases, purely psychological problems, or mainly caused by social circumstances. The modern consensus is that this either-or thinking was wrong. Psychological disorders almost always involve complex interactions among multiple factors. The biopsychosocial approach examines 4 key factors. First, biological factors include genetic predispositions, brain chemistry imbalances, neurotransmitter dysfunction, and physical health conditions that affect mental health. Second, psychological factors involve thought patterns, emotional responses, coping mechanisms, personality traits, and past experiences that shape how someone interprets and responds to situations. Third, social factors encompass family dynamics, relationship quality, social support networks, life stresses, and socioeconomic conditions that affect well-being. Fourth, cultural factors acknowledge how cultural norms, values, beliefs, and practices influence how disorders are experienced, expressed, and understood across different societies. For example, depression might involve genetic vulnerability, plus negative thinking patterns, plus stressful life circumstances, plus cultural factors affecting how symptoms are expressed. The biopsychosocial model examines biological, psychological, social, and cultural factors, not just genetics alone, or brain chemistry alone, or environmental factors alone. 49. The primacy effect and recency effect describe enhanced memory for items at the beginning and end of lists respectively. Which memory system accounts for the recency effect in list recall? A. Long-term memory. B. Sensory memory. C. Short-term memory. D. Procedural memory. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Short-term memory. Explanation. Option C is correct because the recency effect occurs because items presented last remain in short-term memory during recall, making them readily accessible compared to middle list items. Option A is incorrect because long-term memory accounts for the primacy effect for early items rather than the recency effect for recently presented items. Option B is incorrect because sensory memory holds information only briefly for milliseconds, rather than maintaining recently presented items available for recall tasks. Option D is incorrect because procedural memory stores unconscious skills and procedures rather than maintaining recently presented list items available for immediate recall. Here's a fascinating memory phenomenon that relates to a common experience in list learning and recall. Imagine you're at a party and someone quickly tells you a grocery list to remember: milk, eggs, bread, butter, cheese, apples, chicken, rice, lettuce, tomatoes. A few minutes later, they ask you to recall the list. Psychologists have discovered a predictable pattern in what you'll remember best. You're most likely to recall the first few items: milk, eggs, bread, and the last few items: lettuce, tomatoes. But the items in the middle, butter, cheese, chicken, are often forgotten. This U-shaped memory pattern has two components. The increased memory for the first few items is called the primacy effect, which occurs because these items received more rehearsal and were successfully stored in long-term memory. The increased memory for the last few items is called the recency effect, which happens because these items are still active in short-term memory at the time of recall. The recency effect specifically occurs because the last items haven't had time to fade from short-term memory yet. They're still being actively held in your temporary memory system. This isn't because they're in long-term memory yet, isn't because they're in sensory memory, and isn't because they're in procedural memory. The recency effect occurs because recent items remain in short-term memory. 50. When people try to recall information, they remember it better when good retrieval cues direct them to relevant stored information. How do effective retrieval cues facilitate memory recall? A. They create new memories spontaneously. B. They direct attention to relevant stored information. C. They eliminate all competing memories permanently. D. They automatically transfer sensory to long-term memory. Do you know the answer? Correct answer. B. They direct attention to relevant stored information. Explanation. Option B is correct, because effective retrieval cues work like signposts directing attention toward relevant information stored in long-term memory, making it easier to locate and recall specific memories. Option A is incorrect because retrieval cues help access existing memories rather than creating new memories spontaneously during the recall process. Option C is incorrect because retrieval cues help access specific memories rather than permanently eliminating competing memories from storage. Option D is incorrect because retrieval cues facilitate accessing stored memories rather than transferring information between memory systems during encoding. Let's explore one final memory principle that explains why some memories are easier to retrieve than others. Imagine you're trying to remember where you parked your car at a massive shopping mall. You stand in the parking lot and try to recall, but the memory seems just out of reach. Then you remember, you parked near the entrance with the red sign. Suddenly, remembering the red sign triggers the full memory of your parking location. This demonstrates how retrieval cues work. Retrieval cues are pieces of information that help direct your mental search through long-term memory, guiding you to the specific memory you're trying to find. Think of long-term memory as an enormous library. Without good cues, finding a specific book is nearly impossible. But a good cue is like having the exact call number. It directs you straight to the right shelf. The red sign acted as a retrieval cue that helped you navigate through your memories to find the parking location. Effective retrieval cues share some connection or association with the target memory. They were encoded together or share similar features. These cues don't create new memories spontaneously, don't eliminate competing memories permanently, and don't automatically transfer information between memory systems. Retrieval cues specifically direct attention to relevant stored information, making it easier to locate and recall specific memories from long-term storage. You have reached the end of our first question set. For the free complete exam preparation, visit our website link in the description, where you find thousands more practice questions and comprehensive study guides. Thanks for studying with us today. See you in the next video.